Welcome to The State of Us. Real people with honest opinions and the future of responsible media. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Immigration is a contentious issue in the United States right now, to be sure. Both the political left and right frequently bring up the issue with varying degrees of ideas and ways to address it. Lance and I on The State of Us have talked about this on numerous occasions. We've covered everything from our ideas about how to fix our broken immigration system to some of the history of immigration, and also when the United States has experienced net negative immigration. Today, we have the great privilege of being joined by Sandoval-Strauz, and he is the author of a new book, Barrio America. Lance and I have both read this, and we're excited to share it with you because really, it's a history book, and it does a great job of not only shedding light on immigration and some of the statistics surrounding it, but also kind of the history of discrimination in our country from the 1900s through today. So welcome to the show, and thank you for being on, Andrew.
Thank you so much for having me.
So the book is divided into three parts. There Goes the Neighborhood, Here Comes the Neighborhood, and The Seeds of the Future City. So this fits nicely into our format for The State of Us, and it's kind of what we'll follow today. But of course, no critical conversation could begin without
your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
I just want to say unabashedly, I enjoyed this book tremendously. As a former history teacher, I read through it, and I love the history and the references to what has taken place and then your insight to it. So, just so everybody, to be transparent, I'm a big fan. Even though I've never met you, I really did enjoy your book. So I'm excited to talk to you about it.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad you enjoyed it.
All right. So let's get into it. Much of the 1900s saw great racial tension, as you outline in the book. Caught in the middle were those that couldn't be easily placed into a single racial category. Mainly, this looked at people of brown skin color or someplace in between what was obviously identifiable as black or African American or white. Expand on the limits that you refer to that some white individuals placed on how Mexican Americans could be treated. Just how bad was it?
Well, it could be enormously unfriendly. I mean, there are numerous accounts by Mexican Americans and other ethnic Mexicans in Chicago at this time of being called the N-word, for example. So some white people in the city looked at these Mexican and Mexican American and sometimes Puerto Rican people and decided, oh, well, they're more like black people, therefore we'll use that epithet to kind of degrade them. In terms of everyday treatment, Guadalupe Lozano, who was one of the girls who moves to the neighborhood that I look at in the late 1950s, reports that she and the other small number of Mexican Americans were often chased off the playground, or, when they were just playing in an alley, people would call the police on them. And so in many cases, they're treated with the same kinds of discriminatory attitudes as black people are. I will also say, though, there were some people who saw it differently. They looked at these new people and said, well, they're also Catholic and we're Catholic. This is a heavily Polish and Bohemian neighborhood. So in many cases, they knew them from church, and that could be sort of a place where there was some bridging between communities. There was also a memory that Guadalupe Lozano had, as when she was a little girl in 1961, there was a man yelling at her and her friends from a building window, and they kept playing, and so he came out and kicked her. A police officer came, grabbed the guy, and said, if you go to these kids again, I'm going to throw you in jail. And you'd think that she'd remember this as, what a horrible incident, but her memory is that was the first time any white person did anything to help us. So it was a difficult and contentious time for these people at this particular time and place.
Well, and it's interesting too, because, you share that experience, and I assume that most people would think of, okay, if this situation, happened to them, you'd expect that individual to get arrested, not get a warning. And I know you talk about that a little bit, but the fact is, and that's, I think, so important, is that, the person that this happened to, they see it in such a positive light, that, somebody, that a white person would stand up like that for them and even go so far as to even just give a warning. to the person that had done this. So I think it's very, very telling of that. One thing I did want to mention too that I thought was interesting that you talked about, because when we think about discrimination, we don't always think about how it happens internally between the races that are typically discriminated against by whites. But there was some of that going on as well, wasn't there, in regards to, there were a number of Mexican Americans who would try to pass off as white, and even go so far as to discriminate against African Americans to try to fit in, so to speak, with the whites in the area.
Yeah, especially in the Southwest, in places like Texas. Technically, according to the law, Mexican Americans and other people of Hispanic ancestry were legally white. According to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo from 1848, Mexican people who became U.S. citizens when all of that land was ceded to the United States had all the rights, effectively, of white people. And some of them, even though they were discriminated against in everyday practice, really clung to that and said, we have this technical legal status. That's the only thing standing between us and being treated like black people. So that was the attitude of many of the leaders. Now, at the grassroots, especially people involved with the labor movement, there were others who said, no, we actually are in a position much like them, and we have to seek out, alliances and friendship with them because, we're both up against white supremacists. So, for example, that same Guadalupe Lozano remembers that, at a time when a lot of the white girls at her school, would sort of not invite her to parties, she said, I found a lot of friends among the black kids. So again, at the grassroots, you often did see those kinds of alliances forming, even when the leadership was a little bit behind in how to think about race.
So ultimately today, we're trying to answer the question, can immigration save cities? And I think your book makes a pretty clear statement about that, and just the facts of history, right? I mean, this is in many ways an account of what has happened and what it can inform us about what might happen in the future. But in order to answer that question, part of what we're going to spend time on is some of this backstory and the history and what was going on in the 1900s. Before we go any further, though, I mentioned the name of your book, Barrio America, and help our listeners understand a little bit too. Why did you choose that title for this book? What's the significance of it?
Well, essentially, barrio just means neighborhood in Spanish. It's one of a couple of words that's used to refer to, a particular locale. And I think that, in a sense, just to get people's attention, to say, like, the word barrio, sometimes there's a negative connotation attached to that. But I wanted to say, this is a big and growing part of what America is today. So to sort of put the words barrio and America in the title, and then with the subtitle, How Latino Immigrants Saved Urban America, gives you sort of a full sense of the subject matter and the argument of the book. And puts
the word barrio in a more positive light. Because like you said, it kind of it has that connotation among some people as like the slum or the hood or something, in that aspect. But the way you phrase it, you're talking about it in a very positive light.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because in Spanish, barrio doesn't really have positive or negative connotations, whether in, any country in Latin America. It just means like a part of the city. And I wanted to emphasize how important these growing barrios are to the well-being of America's cities.
It made me think about, after having read the book, we have those ideas when we start, we just see the title and you're judging a book by its cover. And then as you read, you kind of get a different idea of it. One of the things that occurred to me later on is you talk some about the mass protests that occurred as a result of some of the legislation that had been passed, and that, the historic size of some of these in regards to immigrants of all backgrounds, documented and undocumented, who took to the streets to, in a very patriotic way, make their objections known. And, most notably, they were really smart about how they went about it. They bring out American flags, big and small, of all sizes. And part of what I think gets lost is there's a lot of times this us versus them mentality, and probably part of what was wise about that, or at least what I thought perhaps you were getting at, was indicating, they look at this as their country and they have a lot of pride in the fact that they're here. And sometimes that gets lost. So it's interesting that when you explain the title that way, kind of how that hopefully correlates to other parts of the book, and it speaks through in a number of ways.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think we have to remember that the great majority of all Latinos in this country are U.S. citizens or permanent residents, right? So the sense of most Latinos being immigrants is just simply incorrect. So I completely agree with you that sometimes people look at this in an us versus them framework, but Latinos are very much us and are more so every day.
So for a lot of the book, you go back and forth between Oak Cliff in Dallas and Chicago's Little Village. These two neighborhoods are kind of what you use to paint the picture as kind of symbols of what the rest of the country has gone through at different points. So how do they relate to other parts of the country? If I'm listening and I've never been to these places and I don't live in these places, how do we make them real for people in other areas?
Sure. Well, Chicago is a big industrial city that grew up primarily in the 19th century. And so a lot of the employment base was huge factories. They were making agricultural equipment. They were making electrical equipment. They were making sort of steel. They were slaughtering animals. And those kinds of heavy industrial jobs are a big part of the city and the landscape. And those kinds of cities, and if you want to think about Milwaukee as a similar city, St. Louis is a similar city, Pittsburgh, there are lots of other big classic industrial cities that have really had a hard time since they peaked in about 1950 in their growth. And a lot of these cities were losing population very quickly throughout the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. And really, it's immigration. Again, people from Latin America is the single biggest group, but immigration from the rest of the world is important too, in sort of bringing the numbers back in the cities, just so that they don't end up abandoned. Like if you think of Detroit or Youngstown, you sort of get that vision of those books of ruins photography with, abandoned classrooms and empty railroad stations and, ghost town like factories. That is the potential fate of industrial America. Now, Dallas, where I look at the neighborhood Oak Cliff, is a Sunbelt city. Now, these are cities that grew up mostly during the 20th century when they really began to grow. And they did a lot of growing on the basis of white collar work, but also of military contracting and sort of building things through essentially government contracts. So if you think of cities like Los Angeles, Phoenix, Orlando, those are Sunbelt cities. So each of the two cities I look at kind of represents one big part of the two main categories of urbanism in the U.S.
Okay, that's interesting that you mentioned Sunbelt because it's then later in the 20th century, basically, I think around the end of World War II into the 1950s, how those major metropolitan areas in the United States start to decrease in size as the introduction of the automobile and the federal government making it easier to buy houses. People begin to move into what we call the suburbs and leave some of the northern factories and go to the towns out west, and also just to leave the big city, the downtowns, and move out into the suburbs. So, what role does that play in the immigrants then coming in, the Latinos coming in and filling that void?
Yeah, essentially they have a similar effect, but under slightly different circumstances in, what some call the Rust Belt or the Frost Belt on one hand, and the Sun Belt on the other. In the Rust Belt, cities are losing population because of both suburbanization is a primary reason, and some migration to the Sun Belt. So these are cities that are looking at declining population, abandonment of neighborhoods, shuttering of factories. And so in those cities, it's often, Latinos and other immigrants that allow them to stabilize their population. Some cities begin to grow again, but at the very least, a lot of cities like Chicago and Milwaukee, the population stops shrinking and begins to stabilize in the 1980s mainly and afterward because of the influx of immigrants. In the Sun Belt, essentially you have fast-growing, very dynamic cities which are gaining population. But if you break out the population gains by sort of demographic, you'll find that if not for Latinos especially, that there would be no growth. So in a city like Houston, over the past about 40 years would not have seen any population growth at all, if not for, close to 1 million new Latino residents moving in. Same thing in LA, right? It's a growing city, but that growth is attributable first and foremost, and in some cases almost exclusively, just to Latinos, but also to other immigrants as a sort of a smaller proportion, just because Latinos have for about the past 40 years been such a large majority of all those newcomers to the U.S.
You've got all this stuff going on in the 1900s. Early on, you're looking at city growth. In the middle of the century, you're looking at problems with city growth in part due to racial tension. And one of the things that I thought you illuminated well in the book, that, those of us that didn't live through that time, and I did not, have kind of an idea of, okay, we're going through all this civil rights stuff. There's all this racial tension. But you did a nice job, I thought, of driving home real specific examples of some of what took place. And a couple of things that stood out to me were the lending practices, where it was not only common, but as you point out, according to national standards enshrined in the Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual, no loan should be given that would place inharmonious racial or nationality groups in a neighborhood. And then, you look at taking that one step further in regards to housing, the home sales on contract, which were essentially this whole idea of, since you can't get a traditional loan, I'll let you, basically loan the money from me to buy your house over time on contract. But in reality, there was no intention of making it easy for these immigrants to buy these homes. Instead, it was, we're going to trap you in this perpetual cycle of crazy high interest rates. And when things go wrong, refuse to fix them or make you pay, to fix them, and then ultimately reclaim the property and sell it again. And you talk about, some properties were sold several times over to different people. So there's all these things going on, a lot of those things which I, just wasn't aware of until we read this. So I think it's hopefully people take an opportunity to, at the very least, look some of this up, because it hopefully gives people an understanding of just how bad it all was. So we've got more to talk about. We're moving into Here Comes the Neighborhood. We're going to talk a little bit about what led to the rise of some of these cities and how they started to improve as a result of immigrants and some of the working class. We've been talking with the author of the new book, Barrio America, Andrew Sandoval-Strauz, and we've got plenty more to come on The State of Us, so keep it right here, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Immigration, one of the contentious issues of our time, both the left and right, very divided over how to talk about this and where to go from here, which is actually pretty interesting, because in the book, Barrio America, Andrew Sandoval-Strauz highlights for us that it wasn't always this way. In fact, there was a time, believe it or not, where the Republican Party wanted to claim the Latino vote and almost got it done until they got cold feet. So it's hard to imagine, but that wasn't even 50 years ago. It was more like 15 years ago when they were seriously looking at this and trying to do stuff about it. So one of the things that I think is important to remember as we move forward here is the political landscape that we see today is by no means the way that it's always been, and parties' views on immigrations have shifted over the decades for certain. One of the things that you actually bring up, Andrew, is the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which is also known as the Hart-Celler Act. And it was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson. The law abolished the national origins formula, which is what preceded this, and had been the basis of U.S. immigration policy since the 1920s. It seems like, when you read about the Immigration and Nationality Act, that it had pretty good intentions, but then maybe it didn't necessarily yield good results. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I think the first thing to say is that the 1965 Immigration Act was by and large successful, except for the one place in which there were deliberate limits put on new immigration. So if we think back to the 1924 national origins formula, that reserved 75% of the visas to come to the United States to only 3 countries, and huge parts of the world, essentially virtually all of Asia, Africa, were just simply put in a status where people could not come here from those countries legally for decades. Now, the idea behind the 1965 Act was to remove all of those varieties of discrimination and say everybody should have an equal chance. Now, that was a terrific idea. That is essentially what they did. But at the last second, 2 segregationist senators, in particular, Senator Eastman of Mississippi and Senator Ervin of North Carolina, essentially blackmailed President Johnson, said, listen, we control key committees here, and if you don't change one part of the law to make it harder for people from Latin America to come here, we're going to just tank the entire bill. And again, these were people who had been fighting against integration throughout the 1950s and the 1960s, voted against all the civil rights legislation, that was finally passed in the mid 60s. And their new goal was, let's keep these Latin Americans out. Because of that, for the first time ever in 1965, limits were put on immigration within the Western Hemisphere, right? That is between or among the Americas. Even the 1924 Act did not numerically limit immigration from places like Mexico because American agriculture could in no way survive without it. So ironically, at the same time that the 1965 Act is opening the doors for immigration to so much of the rest of the world, is actually closing the door or leaving only a bit of a crack open for people from Latin America. And that's sort of what has led to the creation of lots of people whose movements in and out of the United States would have been perfectly legal for decades were suddenly rendered illegal.
Well, go ahead, Lance.
Well, so really it kind of changed the ball game for them, right? For a different set of rules for people coming from Mexico who had, whether it was migrant workers or, we called them earlier in the 20th century, birds of paradise, where people came in, worked in the United States, from Europe, worked for a while and sent money back and then went back home. There was a lot of transient movement between Mexico and the United States. And then what you're saying is the 1965 Immigration Act kind of shut that down or made it more difficult.
Again, the idea was a good one. They said, let's assign 20,000 visas to each country. That way, people from every place in the world will have an equal shot. And, that sounds good in principle, but remember that some countries have a very long border with the United States and a long history of migration. So 20,000 visas was nowhere near enough for Mexico, right? This country had, for example, incorporated Mexican workers as a fundamental part of the World War II campaign, because with so many American-born people all fighting in Europe and in the Pacific, there were not enough people to do the basic farm work. So to keep our troops fed overseas, we had to have a labor force here, and that was a strongly Mexican one.
You're referring to the Bracero
yes, exactly. The Bracero program that ran from 1942 was there specifically to make sure that America had enough agricultural labor. And again, the sort of unintended consequence of the 1965 Act was that it made it much more difficult for people accustomed to coming and going to work to do so.
Well, like often things in government, we find they sound good in principle. Because again, at first glance, I'd assume that most people would say, well, yeah, you just give the same limit to every country and it's no big deal. But at the same time, you also have to consider there are some countries where you may not even have that many people that are trying to apply. So you've got slots that go completely unused based on a quota system that doesn't necessarily take into account the kind of supply and demand relationship that not only we've had, historically with these places, but also what our economy is built on. Different types of workers from different countries that fit different needs. Not all countries have the same type of workers available with the same types of skills and so forth. And I think that seems to be an important part of it. Well, not just geography, which obviously plays a significant role, but also the availability of the workforce. And you spend some time talking about, too, immigration historically is not just linked to what we need in our economy, but also what's been lacking in other economies. And as there were some of these issues in Mexico, it led to more and more seeking to come to the United States, whether legal or not, because that, for them, seemed to be their only real viable option.
Exactly. So in 1965, that marks the beginning of a pretty long agricultural crisis in Mexico. It is harder and harder for small farmers to get by planting and harvesting corn, beans, and other crops. And you see just widespread poverty, so that by the late 60s and early 70s, the level of malnutrition is so severe in Mexico that you're seeing about 1,000 children dying of malnutrition every day. It's just a horrible situation.
Wait a second. If you would, just share that statistic one more time. I want to make sure people understand what you just said.
Yeah, exactly. There was widespread hunger in Mexico. And of course, that kind of malnutrition is most dangerous for young people whose bodies are not sort of fully grown and strong. As a result, you saw about 350,000 children dying of malnutrition a year in Mexico in the late 60s and very early 70s. So that's almost 1,000 kids a day. It's just a horrible figure. And under those circumstances, you can certainly imagine why parents would do anything they could to find some kind of, economic slot for themselves where they could have a good remunerative job and feed their children.
You have that going on. I mean, this terrible malnutrition issue that they're facing. And on top of that, simultaneously in the U.S., and this is where the policy and the situation in both of these two countries kind of created this little bit of a perfect storm. The Nationality Act of 1965, you're putting in place these new quotas at a time when perhaps more than ever, you have Mexicans who are interested in coming into the United States to literally save their children. So, pretty interesting there. But I think that's part of why, and I know we're spending a lot of time on the history today, which Lance and I do a good bit with our listeners, because it often informs people understanding, this didn't just happen out of nowhere. This relationship was built, over more than a century, and it ebbed and flowed based kind of on what was happening in both countries at different times. And I liked, Lance, when you highlighted the component that, so many of these people traditionally and historically weren't looking to even stay forever. They were looking to make life better for themselves, send money back, and eventually return home. And in some cases, as we've seen, once things got worse in the United States and Mexico's economy improved, you had the reverse happening, which kind of takes us up to today, the 2000s.
But what I like in the book, though, is that you make it personal. You bring in a lot of stories about individuals, and you talk about overall how, okay, everybody, the mindset is for many Americans that, well, they're just coming here to work and this and that and the other, but they actually improved these neighborhoods and these cities. I mean, crime rate went down. They were buying houses. They were paying taxes. They brought in money that would be used for opening of businesses, but keeping schools open. Would you mind going into that just a little bit? Because that was very mind opening as far as they weren't just coming here to work and send money back, but they were also then benefiting these places that were losing population.
Well, and the thing that you mentioned in the book, because my guess is you'll bring this up here, you mentioned this idea of people believing that the creative class, so to speak, was responsible for some of the city revitalization, when in reality, what Lance is bringing up is that may not have been the case. So tell us, if you would, first, what do you mean by the creative class? And then how is that not necessarily what actually happened?
Well, let's think about the big picture. For about 40 years, America is in what is called the urban crisis, where cities are losing population, they're losing jobs, they're facing fiscal emergencies, crime rates are increasing rapidly, and a lot of people in the 1970s and 1980s were saying, it may just be that the era of the big American city has come and gone, and in the future, people are just going to live in suburbs or elsewhere. It has turned around so dramatically, especially since about the 1990s, that the problems that we have in urban America today are almost the opposite, right? So many people want to live in U.S. cities that rents have gone up quite sharply. And indeed, it's not abandonment, but overcrowding that is causing a lot of difficulties with affordable housing, with affordable places to open a business. So when the question comes to, okay, how do we go from urban crisis to, the new urban crisis, as Richard Florida has called it, and often the focus, so for example, in Richard Florida's 2002 book, is on the creative class. So that is a group that he defines as people who sort of do white collar work that's creative. So screenwriters, filmmakers, people who do specialized kinds of law, people who write books, do advertising, publish magazines and newspapers. And, one of certainly the most widely talked about reason for the urban recovery is indeed this creative class. But what I'm trying to say in the book is that before the creative class moved in, these Latin American migrants were there to begin reviving the cities. I also suggest that not just do these people come first and begin to buy houses and rent houses and open businesses and, patronize other people's businesses, but also the kind of work that these migrants do is often essential to the creative class coming back to the city. So when people, want to come into old neighborhoods that have character and personality, they need home renovation and home construction. That's an industry that's got a lot of Latin American migrants in it. One of the reasons that economists say that, this sort of professional class wants to move to bigger cities is for good restaurants and cafes and clubs. But, if you look at who's preparing the food, who's serving the food, who's, bussing the tables, it's a very heavily Latino and Latina workforce. And then, of course, remember that professional people often come from two career households. That means that if they're working from 9 to 5, they need somebody to pick up their kids at school and look after them. And childcare is a heavily, Latina, heavily generally immigrant, women's sector of the economy. So just to make possible the return of the creative class, you have to have a huge workforce, and Latinos are the biggest part of that workforce.
So we've got plenty more to come. We get to talk a little bit about the last part of the book and kind of where do we go from here? How do we use this information in today's context with some of the issues facing the United States currently? We've been talking about Barrio America, a new book by Andrew Sandoval-Strauz. Keep it right here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Can immigration save cities? Andrew Sandoval-Strauz, the author of Barrio America, believes so. The subtitle of his book, How Latino Immigrants Saved the American City. Saved in the past tense, and how they may yet save some of our future cities. So with that, again, thank you, Andrew, for being on the show. And let's get in here to some of our solution-oriented stuff. One of the main goals on this program, The State of Us, is that we try to discuss solutions or talk about actionable items. Today, the U.S. is facing slowing population growth and struggling rural economies. This is something, Lance, you and I have talked about numerous times as of late, the big problems facing rural economies. So what does history tell us about how immigrants might be part of the solution for these rural areas?
Well, one of the ways that immigrants think about where to go when they come to the United States is A, where are there some people whom I already know who speak my language and can help me get a job? And 2, where is there affordable housing where, my family and I can afford to live? We know that we're going to be at mostly a fairly low wage sectors of the economy. So where can we afford to live? And in, the 1980s, 1990s, and aughts, quite often that combination of available jobs and affordable housing was in the middle of cities because many neighborhoods had emptied out. Looking into the present and the future, now it's rural America that has a lot of the same kinds of problems that people used to associate with urban America. So rural America is facing, slowing economies. It's facing population loss because a lot of the young people who grew up in rural areas, they see that much better job opportunities are over in metro areas, and so they will often leave, which means that the average age of rural populations is going up. There isn't enough of a workforce. This also means that there's a certain amount of affordable housing. So a small but significant portion of Latin American and other migrants are heading to rural areas. So, for example, there are jobs available in meatpacking. There are jobs available in agriculture that allow them to do their work and then live in a very affordable small town. The other thing I think we need to remember is that the opioid epidemic has hit rural America so hard that there are a lot of people of working age that have been essentially taken out of the workforce by addiction and by the predatory, practices of these companies that manufacture opioids. So a lot of Americans have been just harmed so badly by them that they effectively can't work. And so the, new migrants often save local economies by providing a workforce that just isn't there anymore, unfortunately.
Well, and one of the things you talk about in the conclusion of the book and in chapter 11 is a little bit in regards to just how integral immigrants are to maintaining our population. And this isn't something that gets talked about very often, but there's this whole notion that all these people are pouring into our country, right? And they're stealing our jobs and taking away things from us. When in reality, you mention and talk about that we're not even maintaining the necessary birth rate to keep up and replenish our own population. So without immigration, we might actually be in quite a pickle.
Yeah, I was amazed to find this. I agree with you. It's not talked about very much. And before I started working on this book, I had no idea. But the state of America's population is that American-born people of American-born parents are a shrinking part of it. So that if you just looked at those born here, to American-born parents, we could come nowhere near maintaining our population. I should also add that this isn't just the United States. Virtually every advanced industrial and post-industrial economy, from Russia to Italy to Japan to Germany, is facing the same problem. So essentially the solution to that is precisely immigration. Now, what's noticeable also is that the very, very gradual rate of increase of the American population has been consistent for the past 50 years. We're growing at a little less than 1% per year. What has changed is that the reason for this growth has gone from essentially the baby boomer generation, where people were having lots and lots of kids, to immigrants and their kids generating that growth. So essentially, without all of these new immigrants, we're in a situation like Japan, where they can no longer support their retirement systems. They're not going to have enough people to be in their military. They're just sort of in a downward spiral that it's hard to know how they're going to reverse it, because famously, the Japanese do not like immigrants very much at all.
And you talk about in your book how those areas in the United States have been filled by immigrants. But with today's political climate, you also talk about this. The rural areas are where the current administration and politicians in the Republican side have gone to try to get support. So do you have any suggestions on how those of us who are, because we're from a rural area, who are experiencing a lot of the problems you talk about, how can we get our government and the people in our area to encourage that immigrants come here and help us? Because everywhere you go, up and down every street and in every store or window, there is a help wanted sign. And the opioid epidemic, as you mentioned, we're not filling these jobs, yet there's this backlash, for lack of a better term, towards immigrants. What can we do to get people to understand that this is where we can solve our problems?
I mean, I think one way is to look back at the history of immigration. The United States became the world's leading economy because of immigration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, right? The people from primarily Europe that poured into the factories and, made us the greatest economic force in the world. Now, in those same years, you often saw a sort of a pretty heavy anti-immigrant political movement. So that, again, the 1924 National Origins Act was the result of precisely that kind of mobilization. Ironically, right, they're reacting against a flow of people that made us economically great. Right. So I think you might want to say, well, the things that people are falsely saying about Mexican and other Latin American immigrants today, they said exactly the same thing about the immigrants of yesteryear, right? They said,
yep.
Oh, the Italians are all in organized crime. Oh, the Jewish people are clannish and don't talk to outsiders. Oh, the Germans keep speaking German and don't learn the language. They had all kinds of criticisms. And it's amazing how you see exactly the same kind of things being said today. Thankfully, right, in the past, we learned to move away from that and realize that immigration is essential and makes us strong. And all of those earlier generations of immigrants, their kids and grandkids became, right, sort of classic Americans. If you think of, all those World War II platoon movies that showed, how did we unite to defeat fascism? There was always one Irish character, one Protestant character, one character with a conspicuously Polish name, one with a Jewish name, sometimes an African American character. That sense of a pluribus unum, from many one of our national mottos, that continues to work if we'll just let it.
Sorry, Lance and I are just sitting here shaking our head. We've, for a couple years now, we've been digging up information on this on our own. And I think that's part of why, when your book came along, it was rewarding for us to both read, because here's somebody who put in the work to dig this up and put it together in a cohesive way that tells the story that I think we've been trying to communicate to our listeners for a while, which is that, people believe there's kind of two sides to this immigration debate, when in reality, there really only should be one, which is how do we effectively, and, in a humane way, manage this entire process and hopefully help it thrive, because a lot of the misinformation out there is, unfortunately, even for people such as the three of us, I think, who are trying to stay up to date on this type of thing, as you mentioned, had no idea that our birth rate was the type of problem it is until you look into this and realize, oh my gosh, without immigration, we'd be not only in a bad place from a jobs and economy standpoint, but also in regards to Social Security, another area that we don't typically think about when you think about immigration. But you mentioned that in 2010, the Social Security Administration estimated contributions from immigrants at $13 billion per year into the program.
That was, strictly speaking, that's the contribution, the net contribution of undocumented people who come here to work, but because they're undocumented, they can never collect Social Security benefits.
Right.
So they're paying $13 billion every year into the system that they're never going to get out. And that's just the ones that, that don't have the necessary authorization. I think if I could also try to encourage people to remember how this used to be a bipartisan kind of a position, that if you look back at major figures in the history of the Republican Party, like Barry Goldwater, who was from Arizona, Richard Nixon from California, and the Bush family from Texas, they were among the parts of the party saying, listen, we have to go and court these new voters and, suggest to them that, hey, maybe they should be Republicans. Now, the Democrats had, of course, been doing that through, the Nationalities Division and a whole bunch of parts of the Democratic National Committee. But as you folks said in the opening, right, there was a time when the Republican Party actually competed for the votes of this growing part of the population. It wasn't so long ago. I think we should probably go back to that sense of if these are the new Americans, let's go out there and get their votes.
Right. Instead of doing what often happens right now. And you mentioned this on the second to last page in the conclusion. Meanwhile, these same officials, referring to those that are being elected by some of these very rural areas, hand massive tax cuts to corporations, attempt to slash health and welfare programs that rural communities depend on, and facilitate further attacks on organized labor and worker health and safety. All these actions promise to make the rural crisis worse. And what I told Lance, he can attest to this, right before we walked into the studio today, I said, Andrew doesn't draw quite this line. He just kind of sets it up to be drawn. So I'll go ahead and draw it, which is this idea that, the very thing that they're perpetrating, these politicians who are so anti-immigration and want us to be afraid of it, in turn keeps them in power by keeping rural communities suppressed, and keeping them impoverished, and then blaming it on the very thing that could save them so as to never save them, so to keep the politicians in power, so that there can always be this crisis that they're going after. Now, again, that's, some commentary there, and you might not be able to fully back that up, but that's where I went when I read that part right near at the end of the book. And it's something that Lance and I talk about all the time. So we really appreciate you taking the time to come on today, because the State of Us, Lance, is part of TrueChat, which has a mission why don't you tell us what the mission is, Lance? Well,
the mission statement here at TrueChat is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations.
And I think that's what we're trying to do. It's about all coming to the table and making sure that we all have the right facts, the real facts to work off of. And I think that's exactly what Andrew Sandoval-Strauz' new book, Barrio America, does. So, Andrew, any parting words, or you want to let people know how they can get a hold of the book?
Yes, certainly. You can go to any local independent bookstore or online and just ask for Barrio America. It's published by Basic Books, and so they've got pretty wide distribution. Go pick up a copy, or if you want, just go online. They've got just the introduction to the book that's available. Have a read, and if you find you're intrigued by what you see, maybe then pick up the book.
Excellent. We'll be sure to link to it as well. At thestateofus.org. Again, the resource, you can connect with the show there, find out all the different ways to listen, and you'll be able to see the books that Lance and I are currently reading. We've got a number of authors coming on through the rest of November and December, so please keep it here, and you'll see more from the State of Us. Lance, we've challenged people to tune in, right? Mm-hmm. And to invite others to tune in. You're listening to this show. You've been part of this conversation. As you can tell, there's some really important information here. And it's our job to help get it out there to other people. So if you're going to invite somebody to listen to the show, what are the ways individuals could do that?
Well, they can listen to us either through Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, or anywhere else fine podcasts are found.
For the State of Us on TrueChat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change.